I'd caught raccoons, foxes, and even a stray dog sneaking around my chicken coop before, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of Karen Whitaker, president of the Hidden Pines HOA, crouched in my henhouse at dawn, stuffing my farm-fresh eggs into a knockoff designer handbag like some sort of manic Easter bunny. I stood frozen behind the barn, watching through the cracked slats, equal parts horrified and fascinated, as the queen of neighborhood rules committed what could only be described as poultry larceny. The same woman who had fined old Mrs. Turner for planting petunias too close to the sidewalk was now elbow-deep in hay, whispering to my chickens as if they were co-conspirators. Life on the edge of Hidden Pines had always been strange. The HOA treated my small family-run farm like it was a blemish on their pristine cookie-cutter neighborhood, even though technically my property wasn't even under their jurisdiction. My grandparents had built this place long before the HOA gobbled up the surrounding land and planted their beige houses with artificial lawns. Still, they acted as if I were the unwelcome guest, the rogue farmer ruining their home values. Normally I ignored them. I lived for the quiet, raised my hens, sold eggs to friendly neighbors and kept to myself. But for the past few weeks, my peaceful routine had been scrambled, no pun intended. At first I thought it was foxes. A few missing eggs here and there didn't seem odd, given the country setting. I fortified the coop, double-checked the locks and installed motion lights. But when the eggs kept disappearing, I blamed the raccoons. It wasn't until Big Edna, my oversized and grumpy rooster, started acting up that I decided to check the camera footage. That's when I saw it, Karen in her signature tennis skirt and pastel sun visor, slipping through the side gate like she owned the place, scooping up eggs with the precision of someone who'd done it before. She even had the audacity to blow a kiss to the chickens on her way out. I nearly dropped my coffee. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she was confused, maybe she thought they were free-range, maybe she was rescuing them. But no. That woman would rather set her toenails on fire than do a kindness without some sort of agenda. The footage didn't lie, and neither did the smug smile she wore as she left with the eggs in hand. She wasn't confused, she was entitled. The next morning, like clockwork, Karen appeared at my fence, clipboard in hand, sunglasses hiding half her face, and a wide, fake smile stretched across her lips. She didn't directly mention the eggs, but she had the audacity to compliment me on my lovely hens and how much she adored farm-fresh eggs for her famous brunches. I could practically hear the theme song of a crime documentary playing in the background as I smiled politely, biting back every word I wanted to say. It wasn't just the theft that irked me, it was the sheer entitlement of it. The same woman who once threatened to tow my truck for parking 2 feet over an imaginary line now helped herself to my eggs like it was her birthright. The woman who fined the Johnsons for hanging a bird feeder was out here playing chicken burglar at dawn. But here's the thing about living on a farm, you learn patience. Watching Karen strut away that morning, humming some obnoxiously cheerful tune, I didn't yell, didn't confront her, didn't stomp my feet. Instead, I brewed another cup of coffee, pulled up a chair on my porch and watched the sun rise over the fields, plotting my next move. There are 2 types of people in this world. The ones who confront a problem head-on and the ones who sit back, sip their coffee, and make sure the problem learns its lesson the hard way. I am proudly the latter. For their part, the chickens seemed just as outraged. Martha, my most dignified hen, wouldn't lay the next morning, pacing around the coop like a tiny feathered security guard. Gertrude flapped her wings in a fit every time someone walked past the fence. Big Edna, ever the drama king, crowed at Karen's SUV every time it passed, which only fueled the neighborhood gossip that my rooster was aggressive. He wasn't aggressive, he was honest. I spent the next few days pretending nothing had changed. Things may have seemed calm on the surface, but inside, the wheels were turning. Karen kept visiting, casually walking her obnoxious Pomeranian, Pebbles, past my driveway while eyeing the coop like it was her personal grocery store. I knew better than to confront her directly. People like Karen didn't respond to logic or decency. If I wanted to put an end to this, I needed to play the long game. So, I started researching, looking for something that would make Karen think twice before sneaking my eggs again. And that's when I found it, snake sheds. Harmless but terrifying if you didn't know any better. Perfect. Living near the woods, I knew exactly where to find them. With Big Edna and the hens' help, I could turn my coop into a nightmare Karen wouldn't forget. That night as I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, I couldn't help but grin. Karen wanted farm-fresh eggs? Well, she was about to get something a whole lot fresher, and much scarier, than she'd bargained for. And the best part? She'd walk right into it, smug as ever. No need to call the cops or the HOA board. I had everything I needed right here. Chickens, a bit of creativity, and a healthy stockpile of snake skins. Let the games begin. The woods behind my farm were no strangers to snakes. Most were harmless, but they looked terrifying enough to give anyone second thoughts about reaching into a dark corner. Over the years, I'd seen plenty slither through tall grass or sun themselves on rocks near the creek, leaving behind their skins like eerie calling cards. I'd never given them much thought until now. Armed with a burlap sack, I started gathering the sheds, some small and delicate, others long and ragged enough to make even the bravest person hesitate. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my sack was half full, and my plan was starting to come together. Back at the farm, Big Edna greeted me with a crow that sounded almost like a battle cry, as if he knew something was up. The hens clucked curiously as I laid the snake sheds out on the workbench, inspecting each one for maximum shock value. Some were perfect, complete, intact sheds with faint outlines of scales and even ghostly imprints of eyes. Others were torn and frayed, looking even more sinister. I knew exactly how to arrange them to give Karen the scare of a lifetime. The next morning as I worked on the coop, making sure every corner was spotless, I noticed Karen lingering by the property line, her little dog yapping at nothing. She pretended to check her phone, but I could feel her eyes glued to the coop, probably making sure there was still a fresh supply of eggs. I played it cool, whistling a tune as I hammered away, but inside I was grinning. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Over the next few days I kept collecting snake sheds and even enlisted the help of old Joe, a neighbor who used to run the local bait shop and knew the woods like the back of his hand. He found it hilarious when I told him what I was up to. The next day, Joe showed up with a plastic bin full of extra snake sheds he'd been saving for a good reason. "Been waiting for the perfect time to use these?" he laughed, handing them over. With my collection now resembling a small horror museum, it was time to set the plan in motion. That Friday the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind howled through the trees, setting the perfect atmosphere. As the storm approached, I carefully arranged the coop, weaving the snake sheds into the hay so they looked like they belonged there, like the coop was crawling with snakes. I even threw in a couple of cheap rubber snakes from the dollar store for added chaos and movement. To top it all off, I rigged up a dummy hen with glowing red eyes using a pair of old LED bike lights. The effect was unsettling even to me. I knew Karen wouldn't stand a chance. Late that afternoon, as the first raindrops began to fall, I saw her sneaking around the side of the property. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. Linda, her equally nosy friend, was with her, holding a floral umbrella and clearly uncomfortable with the muddy conditions. I ducked behind the barn ready for the show. Watching them tiptoe toward the coop, oblivious to the brewing storm and the trap waiting inside, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Karen opened the door to the coop with the kind of confidence that comes from thinking the world owes you something. I watched as she reached into the nest, expecting to find the usual fresh, warm eggs. Instead, her hand came up tangled in what looked like a nest of snakes. The sound she made was half shriek, half banshee wail as she stumbled backward, knocking Linda into a mud puddle. The glowing eyes of the dummy hen flickered to life just as Karen scrambled to her feet, slipping and sliding as she tried to regain her composure. Linda, now equally panicked, screamed and flung her umbrella away, running full tilt toward the street, leaving Karen behind. Karen, covered in mud, flailed around like a marionette with its strings cut, slipping every time she tried to stand. Meanwhile, the hens, thoroughly riled up, flapped and squawked around her, adding to the chaos. Big Edna, sensing his moment to shine, flew at her head like a feathery missile, forcing her to duck and crawl away on her hands and knees. I leaned against the barn, sipping my coffee, watching what felt like a live-action comedy unfold before me. Storm clouds overhead, the glowing eyes, the snake skins, and Karen's utter disbelief. It was even better than I had imagined. The sight of her scrambling out of the coop, soaked and humiliated, was a memory I would cherish forever. Finally, she managed to get to her feet, glaring back at the coop as if it had personally betrayed her. She stormed off, dragging her mud-caked dignity back home. The next morning, I half expected her to show up with the sheriff or some HOA task force, but instead, she drove past my property without so much as a sideways glance. For the first time in weeks, the coop remained untouched. The hens laid their eggs in peace, and Big Edna strutted around like a king who had defended his castle. But peace didn't last long. A few days later, I found a notice tacked to my mailbox, an official-looking letter with the HOA's logo at the top and a list of violations so ridiculous, I actually laughed out loud. Improper fencing, unregistered livestock, and aggressive poultry. The last one almost made me choke on my coffee. Big Edna aggressive? Sure, but only toward egg thieves. It was clear that Karen wasn't done yet. She was embarrassed but wasn't about to back down. Now that she couldn't steal my eggs quietly, she'd try to use the HOA regulations to get to me. As I read through the letter, shaking my head at the absurdity, I realized this wasn't just about eggs anymore. Karen wasn't just trying to punish me for humiliating her, she was trying to push me off my own land. I glanced over at the hens peacefully pecking around in the yard and Big Edna, who gave a proud little crow as if he sensed the storm coming. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen had declared war, and if she thought a few phony violations were enough to scare me, she clearly didn't know me as well as she thought. She'd messed with the wrong farmer. This time, I wasn't just defending eggs, I was defending everything I loved about this farm. The game was on. The next week, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors, and I could feel the tension thickening like molasses in the summer heat. Karen had stepped up her game. I woke up one morning to find 3 more official-looking notices tacked to my fence posts, each more absurd than the last. One accused me of operating an unregulated poultry distribution center, another cited noise disturbances caused by unruly fowl, and the last claimed improper placement of agricultural decor, which I could only assume referred to the wooden chicken-shaped sign my grandmother had painted 40 years ago. Karen's vendetta had officially escalated from petty theft to full-blown HOA warfare, and she was dragging the entire neighborhood into it. Despite not technically being part of the HOA, Karen was trying to push for my property, and a few small farms nearby, to be annexed under their rules. If she succeeded, she could slap us all with HOA regulations, ban roosters, control what we could plant, and probably even dictate the color of our barns. I wasn't just up against Karen's ego anymore. This was about the future of the farm itself. I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, but there was something she didn't know. The other farmers around here might have kept quiet to avoid HOA drama, but they weren't exactly fans of hers either. Old Joe, the same guy who'd helped me gather snake sheds, stopped by that afternoon with a smirk and a thermos of sweet tea. He'd heard through the grapevine about Karen's annexation plan and assured me I wouldn't be fighting this battle alone. Turns out, Karen had left a trail of resentment wider than the main road. The Harris family up the hill, the Gwynn family who sold heirloom tomatoes at the local market, even Mrs. Langley who knitted sweaters for goats, they all had stories of Karen sticking her nose where it didn't belong. By the end of the day we had a plan. It wasn't just about stopping the annexation, it was about ensuring Karen's next move would end with her embarrassing herself in front of the whole town. We met late that evening at Joe's barn, lanterns flickering as neighbors swapped stories, plotted, and laughed at Karen's expense. Big Edna even wandered in like he was part of the council, puffing his chest out proudly, as though he sensed the importance of the moment. While the adults schemed, Karen continued her antics. A few mornings later, I caught her and Linda wandering past my fence, snapping photos of the coop and pretending to be on a casual walk, despite Karen wearing high heels that were entirely unsuitable for the country road. I stayed out of sight but made sure to let Big Edna roam free. Sure enough, he gave them a good scare, flapping his wings and chasing them halfway down the dirt path. I could only imagine the report she'd file about my aggressive poultry, but at this point, it was more amusing than annoying. As the day of Karen's official inspection approached, the farm buzzed with preparations. The neighbors, now fully invested, helped set up a series of harmless but humiliating traps. Joe rigged up buckets of water balanced on the coop doors, Mrs. Langley stitched a ridiculous banner that read "Welcome HOA Overlords," and hung it across the driveway, and someone, I never did find out who, installed hidden speakers that played clucking and crowing noises on a loop. My personal favorite addition was the collection of rubber snakes and fresh snake sheds artfully scattered across the property, carefully placed to give Karen a nice case of déjà vu. Karen arrived on inspection day with a clipboard and a sour expression, Linda trailing behind her looking less than enthusiastic. They weren't alone either. A small crowd of HOA board members followed, including a few folks who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen strutted toward the coop like she owned the place, stepping over a pile of fresh mud and nearly twisting her ankle. I stayed seated on the porch, arms crossed, watching the show unfold like I had front row seats to the county fair. The traps worked even better than I'd hoped. The second Karen yanked open the coop door, a bucket of water drenched her from head to toe. She gasped, sputtering as the hidden speakers kicked in with a cacophony of clucking and squawking. The board members tried to hold back their laughter but failed miserably. Karen tried to recover, waving her clipboard like a sword, only to turn and nearly step on one of the rubber snakes. She shrieked, spun around, and landed squarely on her backside, flinging the clipboard into the air like a frisbee. Linda tried to help but tripped over her own feet, sprawling into the mud beside her. The board members didn't lift a finger. In fact, Mr. Hastings, one of the members, pulled out his phone and started filming. Karen scrambled to her feet, soaked, muddy, and red-faced, pointing at me with shaking fingers, demanding that the board take immediate action against me for creating a hostile environment. I simply raised my coffee mug in greeting to the delight of the onlookers. But what happened next was the real twist. Mr. Hastings calmly informed Karen that after reviewing the property lines, it turned out my land wasn't, and had never been, subject to HOA jurisdiction. Not only was she wasting everyone's time, but she was also trespassing. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, utterly speechless for once. Linda turned a shade of pale. I didn't think was possible. I didn't think it was possible, but there she was, standing utterly speechless as the board members walked away, shaking their heads and chuckling to themselves. Karen, soaked, humiliated, and stripped of authority, stormed off the property without uttering another word. But I knew better than to think she was finished. Karen was the type to double down, not back off, and sure enough, the next morning she was spotted at the cafe downtown, gossiping furiously and hinting that she still had one last card to play. The annexation meeting was still scheduled, and if Karen could twist enough arms or spin enough lies, there was a chance she might still pull it off. As I stood in the pasture that evening watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized the stakes were higher than just eggs and Karen's bruised ego. If she succeeded in dragging my farm under HOA control, everything my grandparents built, everything I loved about this place, could be stripped away. No more Big Edna. No more fresh eggs for neighbors. No more freedom to run my farm as I saw fit. Karen wanted to turn my home into just another extension of Hidden Pines, and I couldn't let that happen. The wind picked up as the sun disappeared, and the chickens shuffled into the coop, content and unaware of the storm still brewing. I wasn't just annoyed anymore, I was ready for a full-on showdown. Karen might have embarrassed herself today, but she wasn't finished, and neither was I. This wasn't just about beating her at her own game. This was about making sure that when she finally fell, it was in front of everyone with no way to claw her way back up. The battle wasn't over, but I had the advantage now, and I planned to make the most of it. The night before the town meeting, I barely slept. I sat on the porch, rocking slowly, listening to the sounds of the farm, thinking about everything Karen had done. The stolen eggs, the phony violations, the pathetic attempts to annex my land. It all swirled in my head like a tornado. This wasn't just a petty squabble anymore. If Karen got her way, I'd lose the right to work the land my grandparents built with their bare hands. The thought of this place becoming just another HOA-regulated plot of grass with plastic flowers and silent, sanitized lawns made my stomach turn. I knew Karen would come swinging with everything she had left, but so would I. By the time the meeting started, the small town hall was packed. Every farmer, neighbor, and chicken enthusiast who had ever tangled with Karen showed up. There were folks I hadn't seen in years, some leaning against the walls, others packed shoulder to shoulder on the old wooden benches. The air buzzed with tension, but also something else, solidarity. Karen strutted in like she was still queen of Hidden Pines, dressed in her finest floral blouse and armed with a stack of papers that I knew were full of her usual nonsense. Linda followed behind, looking more like a battered soldier than a loyal sidekick, her eyes glued to the floor. The meeting kicked off with Mr. Hastings from the board addressing the proposed annexation. Karen wasted no time taking the floor, plastering on her fake smile as she spun a tale about how the neighboring farms were unmaintained eyesores and obvious dangers to the community. She pointed to me specifically, calling my coop a breeding ground for disease, blaming Big Edna for aggressive behavior, and even having the nerve to claim that my chickens were ruining the air quality for the neighborhood. I sat still, letting her ramble, letting her confidence swell because I knew what was coming. Karen flipped through photos, including one of herself, pitiful and muddy, holding her clipboard like a weapon. She painted herself as a victim, a martyr, sacrificing her peace of mind for the good of the neighborhood. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes. It was clear that even they were tired of her antics. Still, Karen pressed on, demanding that the annexation vote move forward so she could finally bring order and respectability to the surrounding properties. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up slowly, holding nothing but a flash drive and a remote control. I looked around the room, taking in the familiar faces, the friends who had stood by me for years. Then, I calmly plugged the drive into the projector and hit play on the wall behind me. The room fell silent. The grainy security footage lit up the room, and the place went dead silent as Karen, clear as day, appeared on screen. There she was, sneaking into my coop and stuffing eggs into her designer bag like a kid in a candy store. The footage kept rolling, showing her return again and again, each time looking more comfortable, more entitled. Gasps rippled through the room and Karen's face drained of color. She stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Linda, seated beside her, slowly slid down in her chair, trying to disappear. I didn't say a word, I just let the footage speak for itself. When it finished, I turned to face the board. I could have ranted or thrown in every insult Karen deserved, but I didn't. Instead, I simply said, "This is the person who wants to control our land." The board didn't even bother to deliberate. Mr. Hastings cleared his throat, glanced at his fellow members, and firmly announced that the annexation proposal was rejected, unanimously. Karen tried to object, but no one was listening. People were already getting up, shaking hands, patting me on the back, congratulating each other. Karen's empire had just crumbled in front of the entire community, and there was no saving it. As people filed out, Karen sat stiff as a board, staring at the floor. Linda made a quick exit, leaving her behind without a second thought. I passed by Karen on my way out and tipped my hat, savoring the small, pitiful whimper she gave in response. I thought that would be the end of it, that Karen would lick her wounds quietly and eventually move on. But no, Karen wasn't done humiliating herself just yet. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, I spotted movement near the coop. I slipped on my boots and crept outside, staying hidden behind the tree line. There she was, Karen, dressed head to toe in black as if she thought she was some kind of ninja, sneaking toward the coop with a duffel bag. She was desperate, probably hoping to salvage whatever pride she had left by grabbing a few eggs and disappearing unnoticed. What she didn't know was that I had one final surprise waiting for her. During the meeting preparations, I had worked with the local wildlife rescue to temporarily relocate a few non-venomous snakes to the farm for pest control. They happened to enjoy resting in the warmth of the coop, and that morning they were out and about, tucked safely in the hay, minding their own business. But to someone like Karen, already paranoid from the snake shed prank, they might as well have been pythons. As soon as Karen opened the coop, the real snakes shifted lazily, flicking their tongues and coiling slightly in surprise. Karen screamed so loud I swear birds took flight in the next county. She dropped the bag, fell backward into the dirt, and scrambled away on all fours. Big Edna crowed triumphantly from the fence post while the snakes, utterly unbothered, returned to their naps. Karen stumbled to her feet and ran straight into Linda, who had apparently come to provide getaway support. The two of them bolted down the road, looking like they'd seen a ghost. By the time they reached Karen's SUV, half the neighborhood was already outside, watching, phones recording, laughter echoing. It was the final nail in the coffin. Within a week, Karen put her house up for sale. The realtor's sign appeared quietly one morning, and by sundown, word had spread like wildfire. No one was surprised and no one shed a tear. As for me, I went back to my normal life. The farm flourished, the hens laid peacefully, and Big Edna proudly wore a handcrafted sheriff's badge from Mrs. Langley on a makeshift harness like he was the king of the county. At the next community potluck, held right on my farm, the neighbors gathered with homemade dishes, fresh eggs, and plenty of laughter. We didn't just celebrate Karen's departure. We celebrated the farm, the freedom we had fought for, and the bond we had as a community. The snakes were returned safely to the rescue, though not before Big Edna gave each one a farewell peck on the nose. As I stood by the coop, watching everyone enjoy themselves, I couldn't help but smile. The farm was safe, the eggs were safe, and best of all, Karen was gone. And the eggs? They were for friends only now.